The rain started just before sunrise, tapping softly against the windows of the old gray house at the end of Maple Street. Most people in town barely noticed the house anymore. The paint was peeling. The porch sagged slightly to one side. The mailbox leaned forward like it had given up years ago. But inside that house sat a woman named Eleanor Brooks, holding a faded photograph against her chest while tears rolled silently down her face. That morning was supposed to have been her 72nd birthday. Not a single person had called. No knock on the door. No card in the mailbox. No text message. Nothing. And as she stared at the old photo of her family smiling together 20 years earlier, she whispered the words that broke her own heart. "I guess people really do forget you when you get old." What Eleanor didn't know was that before the sun would set that same day, one simple act of kindness from a complete stranger would start a chain reaction that would change not only her life, but an entire town forever. Before we begin today's story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Here at Kind Truth Stories, we believe even the smallest act of kindness can change someone's life in ways we may never fully understand. And today's story is proof of that. Eleanor Brooks had once been the kind of woman everybody depended on. For 37 years, she worked as an elementary school librarian in a small Ohio town called Fairfield Ridge. Children adored her. Teachers trusted her. Parents thanked her constantly for helping their children fall in love with books. She remembered every child's favorite story. Every birthday. Every struggle. Every dream. If a student couldn't afford lunch, Eleanor quietly paid for it herself. If a child came to school sad, she somehow noticed before anyone else did. Her office drawer was always filled with crackers, tissues, bandages, and handwritten encouragement notes. People used to say Eleanor had the kindest eyes they had ever seen. But life has a strange way of becoming quiet when people grow older. Her husband Frank had passed away 8 years earlier after battling heart disease. Her son Michael moved to Arizona for work. Her daughter Lisa lived in Chicago with her own busy family. Calls became less frequent each year. At first, Eleanor understood. People had lives. Jobs. Children. Responsibilities. But slowly, the silence became heavier. Days turned into weeks without hearing another voice inside the house. Sometimes Eleanor would turn on the television just to make the rooms feel less empty. Sometimes she drove to the grocery store even when she didn't need anything, simply to speak to a cashier for a few minutes. And every night before bed, she sat beside the window with a cup of tea and looked out at the neighborhood she once felt connected to. The neighborhood had changed too. Families moved away. New people arrived. Most kept to themselves. Nobody really knew Eleanor anymore. At least, that's what she believed. On the morning of her birthday, Eleanor forced herself out of bed and shuffled into the kitchen. She opened the refrigerator and stared at the small chocolate cupcake she had bought for herself the day before. One cupcake. One candle. That was her celebration. She sighed softly and reached for the coffee pot. That's when the power went out. The entire kitchen suddenly fell silent. "No, no, no," Eleanor muttered. Outside, the storm had grown stronger. Wind rattled the trees violently. Rain pounded the roof. Eleanor grabbed a flashlight from the drawer, but when she tried turning it on, the batteries were dead. She sank slowly into a kitchen chair. For a moment, she just sat there in darkness. Completely alone. And for the first time in years, Eleanor cried openly. Meanwhile, across town, 24-year-old Jake Moreno was already having the worst week of his life. Jake worked long shifts delivering groceries for a local delivery service. He had moved to Fairfield Ridge 6 months earlier after losing his construction job in Pittsburgh. His savings were nearly gone. His apartment rent was overdue. And 2 days earlier, his girlfriend had ended their relationship over the phone. Jake felt stuck. Like life was slipping through his hands no matter how hard he worked. That stormy morning, his manager called demanding he cover extra delivery routes because several drivers had called out sick. Jake almost quit on the spot. But he needed the money. So by 7:30 that morning, he was driving through heavy rain delivering groceries to houses across town. Most customers barely looked at him. Some complained about late deliveries caused by the weather. One woman yelled because her eggs had cracked during transport. By noon, Jake's shoes were soaked, his head hurt, and his patience was gone. Then he received one final delivery request. Maple Street. Last house on the block. He almost rejected it. But something made him accept. When Jake pulled up to Eleanor's house, he frowned slightly. The place looked forgotten. He grabbed the grocery bags and hurried toward the porch through pouring rain. Before he could knock, the front door opened slowly. Eleanor stood there wrapped in an old blue sweater. Jake immediately noticed her trembling hands. "Delivery for Eleanor Brooks?" he asked. She nodded gently. "Oh yes, thank you." Her voice sounded fragile. Jake stepped inside just long enough to place the bags on the kitchen counter. That's when he noticed the darkness. "No power?" he asked. "It's been out all morning," Eleanor said softly. Jake looked around. The house felt freezing. And then he saw it. A single cupcake sitting untouched beside one tiny birthday candle. Something inside him paused. "Wait," Jake said carefully. "Is today your birthday?" Eleanor looked embarrassed. "Oh, yes. But it's nothing important." Jake stared at the cupcake for a second. One cupcake. One candle. No decorations. No visitors. No family. His chest tightened unexpectedly. "How old are you today?" he asked. 72. Jake forced a smile. "Well, happy birthday, Eleanor." She smiled politely, but her eyes looked sad. Jake should have left right then. He had more deliveries waiting. But instead, he found himself asking a question that surprised even him. "Do you mind if I stay a minute?" Eleanor blinked in confusion. "You don't have to do that." "I know," Jake said. "But honestly, I could use a break from the rain." For the first time that day, Eleanor gave a real smile. "Well then, I suppose I could make tea. Once the power comes back." Jake looked around and spotted an old gas stove. "My grandma used one of those," he said. "It should still work without electricity." Together, they lit the stove manually. Within minutes, water boiled gently in a kettle. And somehow, over 2 cups of tea in a dark kitchen during a thunderstorm, 2 strangers began talking like old friends. Eleanor told Jake about working in the school library. Jake shared stories about growing up with his single mother. They laughed about terrible cooking disasters. Talked about favorite books. Favorite songs. Favorite memories. For the first time in months, Eleanor forgot how lonely she felt. And for the first time in weeks, Jake forgot how angry he felt at the world. After nearly an hour, Jake glanced at the clock. "I should probably get going." Eleanor nodded, though disappointment flickered across her face. Then Jake noticed the untouched cupcake again. "You haven't eaten your birthday cake." Eleanor chuckled softly. "Didn't feel much like celebrating alone." Jake thought for a moment. Then he did something completely unexpected. He stood up. "Wait here." Before Eleanor could respond, Jake sprinted back into the rain. 20 minutes later, he returned completely soaked, holding a small paper bag. Inside was another cupcake. And 2 candles. Eleanor's eyes widened. "You didn't have to do that." "Yeah," Jake said with a grin. "But birthdays should never be celebrated alone." He placed both cupcakes on the table. lit the candles, and began singing Happy Birthday in the most off-key voice Eleanor had ever heard. Halfway through the song, Eleanor burst into tears. Not quiet tears. Real tears. The kind that come from a place too deep for words. Jake panicked slightly. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you." "No," Eleanor whispered. "You didn't upset me." She wiped her eyes carefully. "You reminded me what kindness feels like." Those words stayed with Jake long after he left the house that afternoon. He couldn't stop thinking about her. That lonely kitchen. That single cupcake. The sadness in her eyes. The next morning, Jake returned to Maple Street before work. This time he carried fresh batteries, a flashlight, and a loaf of warm bread from the bakery down the street. Eleanor answered the door wearing the same blue sweater. But this time, she smiled the moment she saw him. "Well," she said warmly. "Look who survived the storm." Jake laughed. "Barely." Over the following weeks, visiting Eleanor became part of Jake's routine. Sometimes he stopped by for tea. Sometimes he fixed little things around the house. A broken porch rail. A leaky faucet. A stuck window. Eleanor always tried paying him. Jake always refused. "You already pay me," he'd say. "How?" "With those oatmeal cookies." Their friendship slowly became something beautiful. Jake began telling Eleanor things he hadn't told anyone else. How scared he felt about his future. How ashamed he was for struggling financially. How lost he sometimes felt. And Eleanor listened without judgment. "Life rarely moves in straight lines," she told him one evening. "People think successful lives look perfect from beginning to end. But most lives are messy in the middle." Jake nodded quietly. "You really believe things can get better?" Eleanor smiled gently. "I believe kindness has a way of opening doors we can't yet see." Meanwhile, neighbors began noticing Jake's regular visits. At first, they were simply curious. Then slowly, conversations started. Mrs. Patterson from across the street brought Eleanor homemade soup one afternoon. A teenage boy named Marcus volunteered to mow her lawn. Another neighbor fixed her mailbox. Something strange was happening. One visible act of kindness had quietly inspired others. And Eleanor's lonely house slowly started feeling alive again. One Saturday afternoon, Jake arrived to find Eleanor sitting silently at the kitchen table staring at an old letter. "What's wrong?" he asked softly. Eleanor hesitated. "It's Michael. Her son. He cancelled his visit again." Jake pulled out a chair beside her. "He says work is too busy." Eleanor tried smiling. "But I know the truth." Jake frowned slightly. "What truth?" She looked down at her hands. "I think people get uncomfortable around aging parents. Watching someone grow old reminds them time is passing." Jake didn't know what to say. Because deep down, he feared she might be right. Eleanor folded the letter carefully. "I don't blame him," she whispered. "Life moves fast." But Jake could hear the heartbreak behind her words. That night, Jake sat alone in his apartment thinking about Eleanor. And suddenly he made a decision. The next morning, he created a social media post. He uploaded a photo of Eleanor's front porch with her permission and wrote, "This is my friend Eleanor. She spent her 72nd birthday alone during a storm until I accidentally showed up with groceries. She spent her life helping children and caring for others. If you have elderly people in your life, please call them. Visit them. They matter more than you realize." Jake expected maybe a few friends to react. Instead, the post exploded. Thousands of shares. Comments flooded in from people across the country. Many admitted they hadn't visited aging relatives in years. Others shared stories about loneliness among seniors. Local news stations contacted Jake asking about Eleanor. At first, Eleanor hated the attention. Oh goodness, she said. People will think I'm some poor helpless old woman. But then something incredible happened. Letters started arriving. Dozens. Then hundreds. Children wrote thanking Eleanor for reminding them of their grandparents. Adults apologized for neglecting elderly family members. Former students somehow recognized her name. One letter came from a man named David Turner. Mrs. Brooks, it read, "You may not remember me, but in 1989 you bought me my first book because my family couldn't afford one. I became a teacher because of you." Eleanor cried reading that letter. Then another arrived. And another. One former student became a nurse because of her encouragement. Another became a writer. Another said Eleanor once sat beside him during lunch when he was being bullied. Each letter carried proof of something Eleanor had forgotten. Her kindness had mattered. Far more than she ever knew. Within months, the town of Fairfield Ridge transformed in small but meaningful ways. Teen volunteers began visiting local nursing homes. A community meal program launched for isolated seniors. Local schools started kindness days inspired by Eleanor's story. And through it all, Eleanor kept saying the same thing. All this happened because one young man decided to stay for tea. Jake's own life changed too. A local contractor saw the viral story and offered him steady work. For the first time in years, Jake felt hopeful again. But more importantly, he felt connected. He no longer drifted through life feeling invisible. One evening during autumn, Jake sat with Eleanor on the porch watching leaves fall across the yard. "You know," he said quietly, "I think you saved me too." Eleanor looked surprised. "How could I possibly save you?" Jake stared at the street thoughtfully. "Before I met you, I was angry at everything. I thought the world was selfish. Cruel. Pointless sometimes." He smiled softly. "But then you showed me something different." Eleanor reached over and squeezed his hand. "No, Jake. You showed yourself something different." That winter, Eleanor's health began declining. At first it was small things. Fatigue. Dizziness. Then came hospital visits. Tests. Doctors speaking in careful voices. Jake stayed beside her through all of it. So did many people from town. The woman who once believed she'd been forgotten now had visitors almost every day. One snowy afternoon, Eleanor sat beside her hospital window while Jake adjusted her blanket. "Do you regret anything?" he asked gently. Eleanor thought for a long moment. "Yes," she admitted. Jake waited quietly. "I regret all the years I stayed silent about my loneliness." She looked toward him. So many older people suffer quietly because they don't want to burden anyone. But loneliness can break a human heart just as surely as illness. Jake swallowed hard. Eleanor smiled softly. "But I also learned something beautiful." "What's that?" "People are kinder than we think. Sometimes they just need reminding." Several weeks later, Eleanor was finally allowed to return home. And when she did, she discovered something waiting outside. Nearly the entire neighborhood stood in her yard holding candles. Children. Teenagers. Parents. Elderly couples. Even people from neighboring towns. Jake stepped forward nervously. "We wanted to thank you." Eleanor looked stunned. "For what?" "For reminding us what community feels like." Tears filled her eyes again. Not tears of loneliness this time, but tears of belonging. That night, Eleanor sat in her living room surrounded by cards, flowers, and laughter echoing through the house. The same house that once felt unbearably empty. And for the first time in many years, she whispered something different before bed. "I'm not forgotten." Months later, Eleanor's story spread nationally after a television interview aired online. Millions watched. People across America began organizing kindness initiatives in their own communities. Some created volunteer programs for seniors. Others started neighborhood support groups. Many simply picked up the phone and called someone they hadn't spoken to in too long. One simple moment of compassion had created ripples far beyond Maple Street. But Eleanor herself remained humble. Whenever reporters asked why her story touched so many people, she always answered the same way. Because everyone wants to feel seen. As spring arrived, Jake helped Eleanor plant flowers in her front garden. Tulips. Daisies. Sunflowers. Eleanor smiled watching children ride bicycles nearby. "It's strange," she said. "What is?" "I used to think growing old meant disappearing." Jake shook his head. "You didn't disappear." "No," Eleanor agreed softly. "I think I just needed someone willing to knock on the door." Years later, after Eleanor peacefully passed away at the age of 78, hundreds of people attended her memorial service. Former students traveled from across the country. Teachers spoke through tears. Neighbors shared stories. Jake stood quietly near the front holding the same faded photograph Eleanor once cried over years earlier. But now he noticed something different about the picture. Eleanor's smile. Warm. Gentle. Kind. The same kindness that had continued spreading long after that rainy birthday afternoon. At the end of the service, Jake stepped up to speak. He looked out at the crowded room and smiled sadly. "When I met Eleanor," he began, "I thought I was delivering groceries." Soft laughter rippled through the room. But what she really delivered was a reminder. He paused carefully. A reminder that kindness matters. That loneliness hides in places we don't always see. And that small moments can save lives. Many people wiped away tears. Jake looked toward Eleanor's photograph one final time. "She once told me people are kinder than we think. Sometimes they just need reminding." After the funeral, something remarkable happened. The town council officially renamed Maple Street's community center in Eleanor's honor. The Eleanor Brooks Kindness Center became a place where volunteers helped seniors, fed struggling families, mentored children, and organized community events. Above the entrance doors, a simple quote was engraved. "Birthdays should never be celebrated alone." Jake visited often. Every time he walked through those doors, he remembered that stormy morning. The dark kitchen. The single cupcake. And one decision that changed everything. Because kindness rarely arrives with fireworks or grand speeches. Sometimes it arrives quietly. As a stranger who chooses to stay for tea. As a phone call. A listening ear. A shared meal. A small act that tells another human being, "You matter." And the truth is, we never fully know how much someone may need that reminder. There are people all around us carrying invisible loneliness. The elderly widow who eats dinner alone every night. The struggling father hiding stress behind a smile. The teenager silently battling depression. The exhausted nurse. The grieving neighbor. The cashier who hasn't heard a kind word all day. Every single person we meet is fighting battles we cannot see. And often, the smallest act of compassion becomes the very thing that helps them keep going. That's the beautiful thing about kindness. It spreads. Quietly. Patiently. From one heart to another. Like ripples across water. Jake often thought about how easily he could have ignored that final delivery request years earlier. He almost had. If he'd been 5 minutes later. If he'd chosen another route. If he'd stayed angry at the world. None of it would have happened. That realization humbled him deeply. Because life changes in ordinary moments more often than extraordinary ones. Not through wealth. Not through fame. But through human connection. Years after Eleanor's passing, Jake became director of the Kindness Center. He dedicated his life to helping isolated seniors and struggling families. Whenever volunteers joined the program, Jake always shared Eleanor's story. And every time, He ended with the same words. Never underestimate the power of making someone feel remembered. One winter evening, a teenage volunteer asked Jake a question after hearing the story. Do you really think one small act can change someone's entire life? Jake smiled gently. He looked toward Eleanor's framed photo hanging on the wall. Then he answered. I know it can. Because somewhere in this world right now, someone feels forgotten. Someone feels invisible. Someone believes nobody notices their pain. And maybe, just maybe, you could become the reason they believe in kindness again. Not through something huge, but through something simple. A conversation. A visit. A smile. A few extra minutes. The kind of moments most people overlook. Eleanor Brooks spent years believing her life no longer mattered. But in the end, her story reached millions of hearts. Not because she was famous. Not because she was powerful. But because kindness leaves fingerprints on people's souls long after moments pass. And those fingerprints continue touching others in ways we may never fully see. So tonight, after this video ends, think about someone you haven't checked on lately. Someone who may need encouragement. Someone who may be quietly hurting. Call them. Visit them. Listen to them. Because the world changes when ordinary people choose kindness over indifference. And sometimes, all it takes to save a life, is staying for tea. Thank you for watching today's story on Kind Truth Stories. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still exists in this world. And remember, even the smallest act of compassion can become the beginning of someone else's healing. The following spring, Fairfield Ridge looked different. Not because new buildings had appeared or roads had changed. The town itself was still small and ordinary. The diner on Main Street still served burnt coffee after noon. The old movie theater still flickered every Friday night. Children still raced bicycles through the sidewalks after school. But something softer had settled over the town. People noticed each other more. Neighbors waved longer. Conversations lasted deeper. And somehow, almost everyone knew the story of Eleanor Brooks. At the Eleanor Brooks Kindness Center, volunteers packed food boxes every Wednesday evening while soft music played in the background. Retired teachers tutored struggling children in small classrooms upstairs. Teenagers visited nursing homes on weekends. Local businesses donated coats during winter. And every person who walked through those doors eventually heard the same story. A lonely woman. A stormy birthday. A stranger who stayed for tea. Jake Moreno still carried that memory everywhere he went. Some nights, after everyone left the center, he sat quietly in Eleanor's old rocking chair near the office window. He kept it there after her passing because somehow it made the building feel warmer. He often caught himself hearing her voice in his mind. People are kinder than we think. Sometimes they just need reminding. One rainy Tuesday evening, Jake stayed late organizing donations when someone knocked gently on the glass entrance door. He glanced at the clock. Almost 9 o'clock. The center was closed. Outside stood a teenage girl wearing a soaked hoodie and carrying a small backpack against her chest. Jake opened the door carefully. Hey. Are you okay? The girl hesitated before answering. I saw the lights on. Jake immediately noticed how nervous she looked. Her eyes were red like she'd been crying for hours. Come inside, he said gently. The girl stepped into the warm lobby slowly. My name's Jake. She nodded faintly. Emma. Jake grabbed a towel from a supply closet and handed it to her. You hungry? Emma looked embarrassed. A little. 10 minutes later, they sat across from each other in the small kitchen area while soup warmed in the microwave. Jake didn't pressure her to talk. Eleanor had taught him that lesson. Lonely people open up faster when they don't feel interrogated. Finally Emma whispered, I didn't know where else to go. Jake leaned back quietly. You don't have to explain everything tonight. Tears suddenly filled her eyes again. My mom's boyfriend told me not to come back. Jake's heart sank. Emma stared down at the table. He said I ruin everything. Those words hit Jake harder than she realized. Because years earlier, during one of his darkest moments, he had believed almost the same thing about himself. He remembered Eleanor sitting beside him in her kitchen saying softly, "Pain lies to people." Now, looking at Emma, Jake understood exactly what Eleanor meant. No kid should hear that, he said gently. Emma shrugged like she was trying not to care. But her trembling hands revealed the truth. Jake contacted emergency youth services while Emma ate slowly beside him. Within an hour, a social worker arrived to help arrange temporary placement. Before leaving, Emma paused near the doorway. "Why are you helping me?" Jake smiled softly. "Someone helped me once when I needed it." Emma nodded slowly. Then she asked a question Jake would never forget. "Do you think people can actually change?" Jake looked toward Eleanor's rocking chair in the corner. Then back at Emma. "Yes," he said firmly. "I really do." Over the following months, Emma became a regular visitor at the Kindness Center. At first, she barely spoke. She kept her hood up constantly and avoided eye contact. But Eleanor used to say healing begins when people feel safe enough to stay. And slowly, Emma stayed. She helped organize books in the reading room, served meals during community dinners, painted murals in the children's hallway. Little by little, the sadness in her eyes softened. One afternoon, Jake found her laughing with elderly volunteers while decorating birthday cards for nursing home residents. And for a moment, he froze. Because the sound of her laughter reminded him so much of Eleanor's kitchen years earlier. Warm. Unexpected. Alive. That same year, Fairfield Ridge experienced the coldest winter in nearly 2 decades. Snowstorms buried roads. Power outages spread across neighborhoods. Emergency shelters overflowed. The Kindness Center became one of the busiest places in town. Volunteers worked around the clock delivering blankets, soup, and medicine to elderly residents trapped inside their homes. Jake barely slept for days. One evening during the storm, a volunteer rushed into the center looking panicked. "There's an older man on Birch Avenue refusing evacuation," she explained breathlessly. "His heat stopped working." Jake immediately grabbed his coat. "I'll go." Emma stood up from a nearby table. "I'm coming too." The drive through snow-covered streets was brutal. Wind howled against the truck while ice coated the roads. When they finally arrived, they found a small house nearly hidden beneath snowdrifts. Jake knocked repeatedly before the door cracked open. An elderly man stared at them suspiciously. "I told the others I'm fine." Jake smiled politely. "Sir, your house is freezing." "I've survived worse." Emma stepped forward carefully. "My grandfather used to say that too." The man looked at her for the first time. She smiled gently. "But surviving isn't the same as being okay." Something in her voice softened him. A few minutes later, they convinced him to come back to the Kindness Center temporarily. During the drive, the old man introduced himself as Walter Green. A retired mechanic. Widowed for 11 years. No children nearby. "No point bothering people," Walter muttered quietly. Jake and Emma exchanged a glance. They had both heard versions of that sentence before. Back at the center, volunteers welcomed Walter warmly. Someone handed him coffee. Another volunteer found him dry clothes. Within an hour, he sat near the fireplace telling stories about repairing cars in the 1970s while children listened wide-eyed. Emma watched him carefully. "You know," she whispered to Jake, "he looked so angry when we first got there." Jake nodded. Loneliness sometimes disguises itself as anger. That sentence stayed with Emma. Because deep down, She realized it described her too. Weeks passed. The storm eventually ended. But Walter kept returning to the center. Then another senior joined. Then another. Before long, Friday community dinners became packed with people who once spent evenings alone. The building buzzed with conversation and laughter. Teenagers played board games with retirees. Families cooked meals together. Volunteers shared stories across generations. It felt less like a charity center and more like a family. And somehow, Eleanor's spirit still seemed present in every room. One afternoon, Jake discovered Emma sitting quietly in the reading room holding an old photograph. "What's that?" he asked. Emma hesitated before showing him. It was a faded picture of her as a little girl sitting beside her mother at a carnival. "She used to be different," Emma whispered. Jake sat beside her. "My mom wasn't always unhappy. She laughed back then." Emma swallowed hard. "I think life just broke her slowly." Jake understood those words more than she knew. Because pain changes people. Sometimes quietly. Sometimes over years. But Eleanor had once taught him another truth too. Broken people can still heal. "You still love her," Jake said softly. Emma nodded immediately. "Even after everything." Jake smiled gently. "That says a lot about your heart." Tears filled Emma's eyes again. "I'm scared I'll become angry like her someday." Jake looked toward the window thoughtfully. Then he repeated something Eleanor once told him during one of his darkest nights. "The people most afraid of hurting others are usually the least likely to do it." Emma stared at him silently. And for the first time in years, a tiny spark of hope flickered inside her. That summer, the Kindness Center launched a new project called the Front Porch Program. Volunteers visited isolated seniors weekly simply to sit and talk. No complicated agenda. No speeches. Just human connection. The idea came directly from Eleanor's story. Jake often reminded volunteers. "You don't realize how healing it is when someone truly listens." The program quickly spread to nearby towns. Local newspapers wrote articles about it. Schools encouraged students to volunteer. Even hospitals began partnering with the center to identify lonely patients needing support after discharge. One evening, Jake received a letter from Chicago. The return address made his breath catch. Lisa Brooks, Eleanor's daughter. Inside was a handwritten note. "Dear Jake, I've spent years carrying guilt I didn't know how to face. Watching Mom's story spread forced me to confront painful truths about myself. I kept telling myself I was busy. That I'd visit next month. Then next year. But time moves faster than we think. Thank you for loving my mother when I failed to show up enough. I want you to know something. Near the end of her life, Mom never spoke with bitterness about me. She only spoke with love. I'm trying to become the kind of person she believed I still could be. Thank you for reminding the world and me what kindness looks like." Jake read the letter twice. Then carefully placed it inside Eleanor's old desk drawer. Because forgiveness, he realized, was another form of kindness too. Months later, Emma graduated high school. The entire Kindness Center attended the ceremony. Walter cried openly when her name was called. Jake cheered louder than anyone. Afterward, Emma hugged him tightly. "I wouldn't be here without this place." Jake shook his head. "No. You got here because you kept going." Emma smiled through tears. But deep down, both of them knew the truth. Kindness had saved her life. Not instantly. Not magically. But slowly. Through consistency. Through patience. Through people who refused to give up on her. That night, after celebrations ended, Emma sat alone in the empty Kindness Center staring at Eleanor's framed photograph. "You started all this," she whispered softly. She imagined Eleanor smiling back. And maybe, somehow, she was. As years passed, Fairfield Ridge became known nationally for its community kindness programs. Researchers visited to study the town's dramatic decrease in elderly isolation and youth homelessness. Journalists wrote stories about how one simple act of compassion had transformed an entire community culture. But Jake always disliked when reporters tried turning him into a hero. "It was never about me," he insisted. "It started with one lonely woman who spent her whole life caring for others." Then he'd usually smile softly and add, "And 1 cup of tea." One autumn morning nearly 10 years after Eleanor's rainy birthday, Jake walked through the community garden behind the center. Children laughed nearby while seniors planted flowers beside them. Emma, now a licensed social worker, organized volunteers near the entrance. Walter played chess with teenagers under a tree. The place felt alive. Full. Connected. Jake stopped near Eleanor's memorial bench and sat quietly. For a long moment, he simply watched people. Different ages. Different struggles. Different stories. Yet somehow all connected through simple acts of care. Then a young boy approached nervously holding a drawing. "Mr. Jake." Jake smiled. "What's up, buddy?" The boy handed him the picture. It showed 2 people sitting at a kitchen table with cupcakes and candles. Above them were the words, "Kindness changes everything." Jake stared at the drawing silently. His throat tightened unexpectedly. "Did someone tell you that story?" he asked softly. The boy nodded. "My grandma did." Jake smiled toward the sky. Because Eleanor's kindness was still traveling through generations. Still healing people she would never meet. Still reminding the world that compassion matters. And maybe that's the most beautiful truth of all. We often believe our lives are measured by achievements. Money. Status. Success. But in the end, the moments people remember most are usually much smaller. The times we made them feel seen. Safe. Valued. Loved. Eleanor Brooks never became famous in the way celebrities do. She never owned expensive things. Never held power. But her kindness created something far greater than recognition. It created belonging. And in a world where so many people quietly feel invisible, belonging can save lives. So if you ever wonder whether small acts matter, whether kindness truly changes anything, remember the lonely woman with 1 cupcake sitting in a dark kitchen during a storm. And remember the stranger who chose to stay. Because sometimes the most important moments in life begin with the simplest decision. To care. 10 years after that stormy birthday on Maple Street, people still talked about Eleanor Brooks like she had only left the room a few minutes ago. Her photograph hung near the entrance of the Kindness Center, surrounded by handwritten notes from strangers, volunteers, children, and families whose lives had been touched by the programs inspired by her story. Some messages were short. "Thank you for reminding me to call my dad." Others were deeply personal. "I was planning to end my life the night I walked into the center. Someone sat with me for 2 hours and listened. That kindness saved me." Jake read those notes often. Not because he wanted praise, but because they reminded him how fragile people can be. And how powerful compassion becomes when someone feels completely alone. One cold November evening, Jake stayed late again after everyone left the center. The building had become quieter over the years. Not empty, just peaceful. The kind of silence filled with memories instead of loneliness. Outside, snow drifted softly across the sidewalks. Jake stood near the front window holding a mug of coffee when he noticed someone sitting on the bench outside. A little girl. Maybe 8 years old. Alone. His heart tightened immediately. He opened the door and stepped into the cold. "Hey there," he said gently. "Are you okay?" The little girl looked up nervously. She wore a thin pink coat much too small for winter weather. Jake crouched slightly to avoid frightening her. "What's your name?" "Mia," she whispered. Jake glanced around the empty street. Where are your parents? Mia looked down at her shoes. My mom's working. At this hour? She works nights. Jake immediately sensed something wasn't right. Did she know you came here? Mia nodded slowly. She told me if I ever got scared, I should come to the kindness building because good people are here. Jake felt something catch in his chest. Good people are here. Those words alone revealed how desperately that mother must have been struggling. Jake invited Mia inside where it was warm. Emma, now 29 and still working closely at the center, had just returned to grab forgotten paperwork. When she saw Mia curled up nervously in a chair, she instantly recognized the look in the child's eyes. Fear mixed with exhaustion. Emma sat beside her gently. Want some hot chocolate? Mia nodded almost immediately. Within minutes, the little girl relaxed slightly, clutching the warm cup with both hands. After some careful conversation, they learned Mia's mother, Rachel, worked double shifts at a nursing facility while trying to avoid eviction. Childcare had fallen apart unexpectedly that evening, and Mia became frightened staying alone in their apartment during the snowstorm. She said this place helps people, Mia explained quietly. Jake and Emma exchanged a silent look. Because once again, Eleanor's kindness was still guiding people toward safety years later. Rachel arrived nearly an hour later, breathless and panicked. The moment she saw Mia safe inside the center, tears flooded her face. I'm so sorry, she kept repeating. I didn't know what else to do. Emma immediately shook her head. You don't need to apologize for needing help. Rachel looked stunned by those words. As if nobody had spoken kindly to her in a very long time. Over the next few weeks, the center quietly helped Rachel with emergency rent support, food assistance, and child care connections. But more importantly, they gave her something she hadn't felt in years. Dignity. Nobody treated her like a failure. Nobody judged her exhaustion. They simply helped. And slowly, Rachel began breathing easier again. One evening while helping organize donations, Rachel admitted something quietly to Emma. The night I sent Mia here, I was falling apart. Emma listened carefully. Rachel wiped tears from her eyes. I kept thinking maybe my daughter deserved a better mother. Emma immediately remembered sitting in that same building years earlier believing she ruined everything. Pain repeated itself in different forms. But kindness could interrupt that cycle. You know what I think? Emma said softly. Rachel shook her head. I think loving your daughter enough to find safe people for her means you're already a better mother than you realize. Rachel broke down crying after hearing that. Not because the words solved everything instantly. But because sometimes exhausted people simply need someone to believe they're still worthy. That winter, Jake noticed something beautiful happening again. People who once received help were now becoming helpers themselves. Rachel started volunteering at community dinners. Walter began teaching teenagers auto repair basics in the workshop behind the center. Former homeless teens mentored struggling kids. Widowed seniors comforted grieving families. The kindness kept multiplying. One act leading into another. Then another. Like Eleanor always believed it would. Near Christmas, the center organized its largest community dinner ever. Hundreds attended. The building glowed with lights and music while volunteers served meals across long tables filled with laughter. Jake walked slowly through the crowd greeting familiar faces. Children chased each other through hallways. Teenagers wrapped donated gifts nearby. Older couples danced softly near the corner radio. And suddenly Jake stopped walking. Because for one brief second, through the crowded room, he thought he saw Eleanor. Blue sweater. Gentle smile. Standing near the kitchen doorway. The vision vanished instantly. But Jake still smiled to himself. Maybe grief never fully leaves people. Maybe love simply changes shape. Later that evening, Emma stood before the crowd holding a microphone nervously. "I want to tell you all something," she began. The room slowly quieted. "When I first came to the center years ago, I believed my life was broken beyond repair." Many listeners watched silently. Emma swallowed hard before continuing. "But someone here taught me that kindness doesn't just help people survive. Sometimes it helps them become who they were always meant to be." She glanced toward Eleanor's photograph hanging on the wall. "And the beautiful thing is, most people offering kindness never fully realize the impact they're making." The room erupted into applause. But many people were crying too. Because deep down, everyone understood that feeling. The longing to matter. To belong. To be seen. After the dinner ended, Jake stepped outside alone for fresh air. Snowflakes drifted softly beneath streetlights. The town looked peaceful. A few minutes later, Walter joined him outside wearing his heavy brown coat. "You know," Walter grumbled softly, "this place saved an old fool like me." Jake chuckled. "You were never a fool." Walter stared out at the snowy street. "I spent years angry after my wife died. Pushed everybody away." He shook his head slowly. "Truth is, loneliness changes people." Jake nodded quietly. Walter smiled faintly. "But kindness changes them too." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Walter asked softly, "Do you think Eleanor knew what she started?" Jake looked through the glowing windows of the center. At the families laughing inside. At the volunteers hugging goodbye. At children running through hallways once filled with silence. And he smiled. "I think she hoped," he answered. Spring arrived early the following year. Flowers bloomed across Fairfield Ridge while the Kindness Center expanded into a second building. Requests for help had grown far beyond what anyone expected. Communities from other states even began copying their programs. One afternoon, Jake received an invitation to speak at a national conference about community kindness initiatives. At first, he refused immediately. Public speaking terrified him. But Emma convinced him. "People need this story," she insisted. A month later, Jake stood nervously before thousands of people inside a large convention hall in Chicago. Bright lights blinded him slightly. His hands trembled. But then he remembered Eleanor sitting calmly in her kitchen during that storm years earlier. And somehow, the fear faded. Jake told them everything. The lonely birthday. The cupcakes. The tea. The letters. The ripple effect that followed. By the end of the speech, many audience members openly wiped away tears. But one moment stood out more than anything else. After the conference ended, a young man approached Jake quietly. "My father lives alone," he admitted. "I haven't visited him in almost 2 years." His voice cracked slightly. "I kept telling myself I was busy." Jake placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Call him tonight." The young man nodded immediately. And once again, another ripple began. That became the true legacy of Eleanor Brooks. Not fame. Not headlines. But moments. Quiet human moments repeating endlessly across lives. A daughter visiting her aging mother. A neighbor checking on someone during winter. A teenager choosing compassion instead of cruelty. A stranger staying long enough to listen. Years later, when Jake himself grew older, younger volunteers often asked him the same question. What made Eleanor so special? Jake always smiled before answering. It wasn't one big thing. Then he'd look around the center carefully. At the people helping each other. At the conversations. At the warmth. She simply made people feel important. And in truth, that may be one of the rarest gifts a person can offer. Because the world moves fast. People feel overlooked. Forgotten. Replaceable. Many smile publicly while privately carrying unbearable loneliness. That's why kindness matters so much. Not because it fixes every problem instantly, but because it reminds people they are not alone while facing those problems. One summer afternoon, Mia, the little girl who once arrived frightened during the snowstorm, walked through the center carrying school supplies for a donation drive. Now 18 years old, she smiled confidently while organizing backpacks for younger children. Jake watched her proudly. "You've grown up fast," he teased. Mia laughed. "So have you." Jake grinned. "That's rude." She hugged him tightly. "Mom says this place changed our lives." Jake shook his head gently. "No. Your mom changed your lives. We just stood beside her a while." Mia looked around thoughtfully. "You know, sometimes I wonder how many people are alive today because of this place." Jake followed her gaze. And for a moment, emotion overwhelmed him. Because the answer was probably far larger than anyone could measure. Not always physically alive, but emotionally alive. Spiritually alive. Hopeful again. Connected again. And all because one lonely woman once whispered, "You reminded me what kindness feels like." Late one evening, long after volunteers left, Jake sat alone once more in Eleanor's rocking chair. The center was quiet except for soft rain tapping against the windows. The same kind of rain that had fallen the day they met. Jake closed his eyes and smiled softly. He could still picture her perfectly. The blue sweater. The trembling hands. The gentle smile behind the sadness. And suddenly, after all these years, he understood something he hadn't fully realized before. That stormy birthday had not only changed Eleanor's life. It had changed his too. Because before meeting her, Jake thought strength meant independence. Handling pain alone. Needing nobody. But Eleanor taught him something deeper. Real strength often looks like vulnerability. Like admitting loneliness. Like opening the door when someone knocks. Like allowing kindness in. And maybe that's why her story continued touching so many hearts across America. Because beneath all our differences, people share the same quiet hopes. To be loved. To be remembered. To matter to someone. Jake slowly stood from the rocking chair and walked toward the front entrance. Before turning off the lights, he looked once more at Eleanor's photograph on the wall. Then he whispered the words he had spoken countless times over the years. "Thank you for the tea." Outside, rain continued falling softly across Fairfield Ridge. Cars passed. Families slept. Lights glowed warmly through windows. And somewhere tonight, another lonely person was probably wondering if anybody noticed them. Maybe a grieving widow. Maybe a struggling teenager. Maybe a tired father. Maybe someone silently fighting battles nobody else could see. And maybe because of Eleanor's story someone would notice them tomorrow. Someone would call. Someone would stop by. Someone would stay a little longer. Because kindness never truly ends. It keeps traveling from heart to heart long after we're gone. And sometimes, the smallest moments become the biggest miracles of all. Thank you for listening to this story on Kind Truth Stories. If this story touched your heart, remember to share kindness wherever you go. You never know whose life may change simply because you chose to care.